Well, welcome to my office here in the park. I'm reading the Quran a little bit this morning. One thing that you find when you read the Quran is that it's mixed up with a lot of things out of the Bible that happened at different times, and oftentimes it puts them at the same time. Like, the biblical story where Moses throws down his staff in front of the Pharaoh and it turns into a serpent. Well, that story shows up in the Quran as well. However, the way it appears in the Quran, it shows up at the same time that Moses runs into the burning bush. Now the problem with the burning bush presents a number of problems for the Muslims, because they will say that all things are possible with Allah, or their God, right? And yet, if you try to explain the Trinity to them, they'll pitch a fit. They just said that, well, that's impossible. How can God become a man? We're not supposed to worship men. We're supposed to worship God. Blah blah blah. But the problem is they can't grasp the idea of, well, what they try to do is, in order for them to explain the Trinity, what they do is they say 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3, right? But the problem is that's not really the definition of the Trinity. It would be more correct probably to say 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. Okay, now another illustration that might be helpful in talking to Muslims regarding the Trinity is they will agree that water is H2O, right? Okay, however, water can be a fluid, or if you freeze it, it can be a solid, or if you boil it, it becomes a vapor. Yet they're all H2O, yet they have 3 different forms. So, but it really, oftentimes it doesn't make any difference how logical you present your arguments, because often Muslims don't think logically. They're not encouraged to question the Quran to start with, and they have a lot of misconceptions. For example, here's a passage out of Surah 5. Now, Surah is like a chapter, and a ayat would be a verse. So this is Surah 5, 116, and I'm reading out of this the Noble Quran, and I like this version because it's sanctioned by the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia, so they can't say, well, that's not a reliable English translation. Well, if it's sanctioned by the top dog, he was once the imam of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Well, if it was sanctioned by him, it more than likely it's reliable. So here's what it says in 116. And remember when Allah will say on the day of resurrection, O Isa, that is Jesus, son of Maryam, or Mary, did you say unto men, worship me and my mother as 2 gods besides Allah? Now see, this is the problem. See, they don't understand the Trinity at all. They have the idea that the Trinity is Father God, Mother God, and Baby God. And that's not the Trinity at all. No Christian's going to suggest that that's the Trinity. But because Muhammad, or whoever wrote the Quran, and I question whether it was even Muhammad, I think it was more likely a bunch of people that put it together, because obviously he didn't do it. He was uneducated. And one of the other things that I run into occasionally is there's a story, one of the chapters of the Quran is called The Cave. And The Cave, it's a story about some young men who, according to the Quran, they didn't worship. They were worshiping one God, and they didn't want to submit to the authority of the leaders of that day. And so they hid in a cave, and the leaders, the emperor, whoever it was, sealed them in the cave, okay? And so then for several hundred years they were sealed into this cave, and then one day somebody rolled the rock away and they came out alive, okay? Well, that's a story that was around long before the Quran was written. It was a folklore based on supposedly a real event. Now, whether it's real or not, we don't really know. But that story had been kicking around for quite a while. But it was more along the lines of these guys worshiped the triune God, the Christian God, and the pagan leader of their area was going to, of course, bring them into submission, and they hid in the cave and so on. So that's what you find in the Quran. You find a lot of disjointed things that they're out of context or they're plagiarized from other places. You'll find, for example, there's a story in the Quran where Jesus makes a bird out of clay, and then he breathes on it, and it flies away. Okay, great miracle, they say. However, that's stolen out of the Gospel of Thomas. That's not in the Gospel. It's stolen from something that we would call pseudepigraphy, basically fiction. Okay, so, but this is what you're dealing with when you're dealing with Muslims, you see. What I was talking about earlier, how they take things that happened at different times in the Bible and they put them together in the same chapter. Okay, here's one, for example. This is in Surah 20, I'm going to start at verse 14. Verily I am Allah, or God, and there's none has the right to be worshipped but me, right? So worship me and perform as-salat, or prayers for my remembrance. Verily the hour is coming, and I am almost hiding in that every person may be rewarded for that which he strives. Therefore let not the one who believes not therein, but follows his own lust, divert from you, therefore, lest you perish. What is that in your right hand, O Musa, or Moses? He says, this is my stick, whereupon I lean, and wherewith I beat down branches for my sheep, and wherein I find other uses. And Allah says, well, cast it down, O Musa. So he cast it down, and behold, it was a snake moving quickly. Okay, so in one, in a few verses before that, Moses, in verse 11, runs into this burning bush. So according to the Quran, this burning bush event and the snake event happened at the same time. But according to the Bible, obviously, they're weeks or months apart if you look at the context of the way the story's written in the Bible, because the throwing down of the serpent happens while they're still in Egypt, and then the event of him out in the wilderness with the flaming bush, that happens someplace totally different. It's not in Egypt at all. It's probably in Midian someplace, right? But that's what you're dealing with. And of course, the Muslims, they will argue, well, the Quran is more correct than anything else. It's even more correct than the Bible because the Bible's been changed many times. And they don't know anything about manuscripts, so sometimes it's good to have a little knowledge of biblical manuscripts, their reliability. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the late 40s, 1940s, 48, somewhere thereabouts. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls is pretty much the whole Old Testament. Okay, so we know that the story of the Old Testament is reliable back to about 200 years BC. Now, see, Muhammad didn't show up till the 6th century after Christ. So there was a lot of time for him to get things mixed up. And even the Jews probably had a few things mixed up by then. And see, some of the controversy is based upon the argument that was happening in about the 4th century with regarding if Jesus is deity, would it be fair to say that Mary is the mother of God? Okay, if he's actually God in the flesh, would it be safe to say that she is the mother of God? Well, Nestorius, he said, no, that's not a good idea. He argued against it. However, Rome and the leaders around Rome, they argued against him, considered him a heretic, and they ran him off. And then at the Council of Ephesus, Mary became the mother of God. And of course, Nestorius' concern was that, you know, if you deify Mary, then she'll end up being worshipped. Well, that's exactly what has happened. And see, so Muhammad didn't understand a lot of the history behind some of these arguments and debates that were going on. So that was 4th century. Then he shows up in the 6th century. By that time, you know, there had been many different factions. Of course, we all know probably the story about the Arian heresy. A guy named Arian of Alexandria. He basically taught the same thing that the Jehovah's Witnesses teach today. He didn't believe in the deity of Christ. And so, based on some of these historical debates that went on in the church, Muhammad, or whoever wrote the Quran, they picked up on whoever they got their information from, and they spun it, you know, based on what they heard, and then they spun it to meet their particular needs. And the thing with Muhammad, see, he grew up in a time when in Mecca there were all these tribal deities. There were stones that represented all the different deities of the Arabian Peninsula. And he got the idea, well, if I destroy all the other deities and I worship one God, then I can get the Jews to side with me, and that would be a good thing. Well, so that's what he did, basically. He tried to present his argument to the Jews. They didn't buy it, so he killed the Jews in Yathrib and Khaybar, and he went to war against the Jews. And that's where a lot of the hatred for the Jews came from, because they didn't buy him as a prophet. Some really twisted ideas about the Bible. And one of the things you'll find about them as well is in the Quran, you'll see lots of quotes about Moses, lots of quotes about things in Genesis, the flood, different things like that. But you won't see any quotes from the book of Isaiah or anything that came after the Babylonian diaspora. With one exception, there are references to Jonah. Okay, so Jonah is one of the minor prophets, obviously. And there's several other minor prophets, but none of them are quoted in the Quran, but there are references to Jonah. So more than likely, Muhammad was exposed to Jews that only believed in the first 5 books and the book of Jonah. They apparently, he wasn't exposed to the books that came about during the time of Christ or after the Babylonian return, you know, after they rebuilt the temple after the Babylonian problem. So it's helpful to understand some of that stuff when you're talking to them.